we talk, and as part of our RLUK strategy, that we talk about the digital shift, and it's clear that the digital shift is a process and not an event. It's a decades-long process now. And what is interesting is that we are now at the stage where we can look back on some of those earlier activities that took part within that digital shift, and we can begin to think about some of the lessons that have been learned. And what we're hoping today is to use the Google's digitization project as a structure upon which to think about some of the issues around collaboration amongst libraries and with third parties, including commercial organizations, and some of the benefits and disadvantages that some of those collaborations might bring. We'll look a little bit about some of the specifics around the Google program and its aspects of success, and perhaps some of the aspects that were less successful, and to see how transformative that program was or was not, and that may be part of the discussion. And the questions that some of this project raised about leadership within our community and within wider society around shifts towards the digital. I mean, we're really thrilled to have Roger and Deanna. I think that for our audience, they are extremely well known. Roger is Program Director at Ithaka S&R, where he leads a team of higher education researchers and consultants, looking into all areas of academic library, scholarly communications, museums, and academic research enterprise. Roger has written and co-written a number of superb reports and presentations, and I'm sure that many of you will have encountered and enjoyed his work over many years. His current research focus areas include organizational leadership and strategy, science policy and research leadership, diversity and community engagement, and collections management and preservation. Deanna is similarly has a similarly stellar CV. She's a senior advisor to Ithaka S&R's program areas in educational transformation and libraries and scholarly communications, and she was previously Ithaka S&R's managing director for a lot of the period during which this book covers, 2003 to 2011. She was Associate Librarian for Library Services at the Library of Congress and appointed President of the Council on Library Resources and President of the Commission on Preservation and Access back in 1995. Diana oversaw the merger of those two organizations into the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLIR, and I'm very pleased to say that we have a very strong relationship with CLIR and been working closely with colleagues there over the past few years. With that, we want to hear more from Roger and Deanna rather than from me, so I'm going to hand over to them both now for some initial comments from them before we move on to some of the more discursive parts of today's program. So Roger, Deanna.
Well, thanks so much, David, for bringing us together for this meeting. It's a real pleasure to participate. Thanks to Matt and you for organizing this. This was such a fun project for us to work on. Deanna's had the pleasure of saying this in some earlier conversations, but this was an example of a true partnership and great collegial effort. This is a topic we've both been passionate about and interested in for many years, and a real great opportunity to share some of our perspective with.
Well, I can add to that Peter Doherty at Princeton University Press asked me if I would write a book on the future of research library. And I said, I don't think so. I'm no better than anyone else at guessing what the future is. And it would be more interesting, I think, to write about what happened with the digitization project, because that was transformative in many ways. And he agreed, and off we went. That's how the book came into being.
And I guess if I may just add, I think this is one of the most important stories that we can tell about the transformation of research libraries. So the shift from book collections being not just in print, but seemingly being in print forever. You don't have to go back too many years to recall a time. I'm sure not everyone participating in this session will recall this time, but you don't actually have to go too far back to remember that this problem, this challenge, this opportunity of digitizing book collections as held in research libraries was seen as a century-long task. It was seen as, I mean, David, you're smiling. I'm sure you remember that when people would say like, oh yes, we must digitize the research libraries and in 100 years they'll be digitized. I mean, this was literally the rhetoric. And so in some ways, one of the challenges of this project has been to try to call to mind to readers, to the library community, to the publisher community, just how quickly expectations and assumptions have changed over this last 10 or 15 years. So we've gone from a point where the idea of being able to search substantially all of the books that have ever been published, do a full text search of all of them and discover them, the prospect of being able to access all of them digitally, nearly all of them digitally, would have seemed like a pipe dream. And what we've tried to tell in this book is the story of how we moved from that being a pipe dream to an imperfect, admittedly imperfect, and I know we'll talk about that, but an imperfect reality. And I think that story is what we've really set out to tell here.
Right. Well, as you noticed in the book, I quote the University of Michigan director is saying, we wanted to digitize our collections, but we thought it would take 100 years. And then along came Google, and it was done in very short order.
So just to get us all on the same page, can you just, I think almost everybody on the call will remember, but just what did Google do? When Google came along, what were they doing? What were they offering to the world?
Well, it's interesting because they did this in a very unlibrary-like way. They identified potential partners. They talked to them. They got them to sign an agreement for digitization, and they just did it. They came into Michigan and Stanford and Harvard, and I guess two others who were public maybe, and they digitized collections. I think only Stanford and Michigan had the complete collection digitized, but I'll talk about that a little bit later in the leadership question. Seeing beyond the immediate, and some of them took advantage of the situation and got a lot more out of it than others, but that's what they did.
And it's really significant that Google brought money, right? So what specifically did they bring? They brought money, but they didn't bring an unbelievable amount of money. They brought a believable amount of money, and they brought technology, new technology, but it wasn't transformatively, radically super secret new technology. It was within the engineering bounds that were available to anyone at that time, more or less, but not being used in libraries for digitization purposes at that point. And so where we come down, and we could talk about this further, they actually served maybe more than the money, more than the technology, they served as a catalyst. And that's one of the hard truths of this book that we believe should cause the library community to pause and consider why it took an external catalyst, and in several different cases. I mean, we can talk about that further, but took an external catalyst to get this work done. And as a result, millions and millions of books from several dozen libraries, many in the United States, but certainly not strictly in the United States. There were efforts in other countries, a number of other countries as well, were digitized, were put into the Google Book Search service, right? So it's the search service, and eventually joined HathiTrust and a variety of other digital repositories as well. So there was this sort of access side to it also.
Yeah, as I recall, and you can correct me, but one of my memories of that time was that, in a sense, one of the innovative things that they brought was the fact that they were digitizing indiscriminately. And this was an argument that people will say, well, look, what you have to do is you look at your collection, you see what are the most important parts, which are the parts that you think are going to be most useful to readers, and you select those titles off the shelf. Whereas Google just went like that and just did everything, and that it almost seemed to be going against some of the principles of librarianship at the time. But it meant they could have that mass production mode of working that perhaps was something that was unfamiliar and possibly even uncomfortable for some within the community at that time.
Yes, and if you recall, Google got into this because it wanted massive content for its advertising and publicity. And they weren't thinking so much about what this would do 2 or 4 libraries. They had a self-interested purpose in setting up the Google project, but it became transformative for the library community.
I'm already going off script in some of the questions I'm asking, but that I was thinking about that question of self-interest and Google's motivation, because of course at that time it was very much the don't be evil, don't do evil phase of Google, and that feeling that they projected, and I think was probably sincere, that they considered themselves to be different from a commercial organization. They had this sense that they believed in a higher purpose that they were trying to serve. And again, how sincere that was, I'm not sure. But but you see very much that whole impetus from Google for the plan was to have as much content as possible. That was their primary goal.
And recall at that time, Google was "don't be evil" in reference to Microsoft, which was evil, right? As the as the conventional wisdom went, and so yeah, I mean, Google was the David to Microsoft's Goliath, and it was a time when even though Google was clearly a commercial organization, it was still in that favorite child, I don't know what to call it, kind of stage of its development. So I think that's important on the one hand, but at the same time, so that was the context that the libraries were thinking about Google when they considered participating in a project that it led. But at the same time, Google was, as Deanna said, like not doing it to help if helping libraries was a happy byproduct, then fine. But the goal was to improve Google search. Google search was this, you also have to remember, Google, the search engine at the time, was searching the web. And the web at the time was not uniform, it still is not uniformly high content, trustworthy content. And so the thinking was that if you could bring materials that had passed the curatorial process of publishers, right, to be published, and then of libraries to be collected, well, that was going to radically increase the quality of the content that was in the search engine and provide all sorts of other benefits as they thought about, you know, early versions of what we now understand to be AI and machine learning and sort of building semantic intelligence into a search apparatus. So there were a lot of self-interested reasons for pursuing this.
And one of the other things that struck me is, you know, this was what, 2004, 5. I said, you know, digital transformation is and the digital shift is a process, but it's still, in those days, it was relatively early days, wasn't it? I mean, things like, you know, the first big deals for journal articles were 97, 98. So these are still people, it was a bit Wild West, wasn't it? It was a bit sort of people were still finding their way, they were still working their way through some of these issues. And probably there was a strong utopian sense for many people, I guess.
I think so. And remember the overwhelming technology at the time the Google project happened was microfilm. And people had not, library directors had not yet thought about what it would mean to digitize collections and make them more widely accessible. And they quickly learned how to deal with that, but it was not obvious from the beginning.
Yeah.
And if I can just pick up on something, David, that you said a moment ago, you know, I think I think we really picked up on two kind of utopian strands as we were thinking about the origin stories of this project. And the one that was familiar to me was the utopian vision that librarians and information professionals have long held about, you know, providing access to all of the world's knowledge, right? That's a familiar story to anyone who's worked as a librarian, certainly. But the other strand of that, which was new to me, I hadn't fully understood before this project, was this sort of if I can call it a sort of Silicon Valley utopian vision about building a kind of universal knowledge machine, almost, which, you know, we can see in what Google was trying to do, you know, searching everything, like that sort of a thing. But I mean, there was some, I'd have to call it like wild-eyed talk among very senior and well-regarded people about, you know, putting all of the world's knowledge into a spaceship so that it could, you know, escape planet Earth. I mean, like really kind of, for me, like weird stuff, but actually the intersection of those two different utopian visions, which was motivated by very, very different purposes, one of which was fundamentally humane, and one of which I would argue was more like techno something or other. That intersection is where the origin of this project kind of in a way comes from.
Can we, so one of the themes that develops throughout the book is that issue around collaboration, both collaboration within the library community, between members of the library community, but then that working with external players. Obviously, Google was the main one here, but that, you know, and those external players either being disruptors or catalysts of that. Is there something that you can say about some of those ideas around how collaboration comes about, where it works well? Are there certain conditions where it doesn't work particularly well? Are there some thoughts there?
Well, it worked well in motivating libraries to make changes, I think. And I remember when I was at the Council on Library and Information Resources during that period, and a lot of librarians were angry that they hadn't been selected, and they wanted to know how they could get involved and be part of this activity. And Google, I think, fortunately, paid little attention to library rules and didn't worry so much about having everyone included. They worried about getting a job done. And that's what we see in the progress of Google. And it's kind of remarkable that a commercial company can go in and just get things done. And that was something new for libraries to understand. And we now see much more collaboration between libraries and commercial partners, and projects taking on a different kind of tone and activity. So I think that was one of the main things that happened. And we talk a lot about collaboration in the book too. And what we tried to show is that librarians have tried to organize different kinds of groups to get different kinds of collections taken care of. And they mostly weren't successful because of money and time and other interests. And I think this helped focus almost everybody on, as you so rightly call it, the digital shift.
And I mean, exactly as Deanna was saying, you know, we trace extensively in the U.S. the history of the Digital Library Federation, which was one of the principal vehicles through which libraries thought they were going to digitize their collections at scale. But ultimately, you know, for all the other kinds of successes that it had, ultimately didn't make a whole lot of progress with that. And, you know, we look at the ways that Internet Archive, for one, but especially Google, really did catalyze that activity from outside. We, you know, you can see a lot of evidence that one of the ways in which Google was effective was by spurring a competitive instinct across the research libraries. At a certain point, not to say all of the libraries, but some of them wanted to be in the club. And there was a lot of club, like realistically, there were a lot of club-based sort of dynamics that are neither good nor bad, so much as they're just the reality of how initiative like this, how this initiative anyway was catalyzed. And you know, so we look at collaboration on the one hand, but we also see collaboration generated through a competitive instinct, which is counterintuitive. And you know, so it's probably the case that these kinds of patterns around how collaboration works, when can collaboration happen on a peer-to-peer basis versus when do you need some kind of third party, maybe a commercial catalyst in order to spur that collaboration on. You know, there's, as Deanna was saying, like undoubtedly broader implications for the library community, because that's not a story. I mean, that's our story is specific to digitization, but those dynamics about how collaboration works, you can find them again and again in other parts of our community's history that we reference. Maybe more so the case in the U.S. than in certain other, you know, national contexts. I don't want to speculate about that, but certainly my view anyway is that recognizing some of these collaboration and competitive patterns makes it feasible to understand how to get collective projects done.
Yeah, I mean, there will be people on this call who remember better than I do, but sort of like, certainly within the UK, on the digitization front, there was a lot of money that was put through GISCs to enable digitization. But again, there was never that feeling that there was going to be enough. So there was always going to be that selection problem, and that's where the sort of, I guess, the collaboration stroke competition between institutions comes in, because you're having to make a case for why the material that's important to you should be the next on the conveyor belt to be digitized. I'm very conscious of the fact that some people will remember more about the history of this than others, and there has been a question about issues around copyright and how they were addressed. It's probably worth just saying a few minutes about Google's attitude towards towards copyright and perhaps some of the issues that generated. That's probably where some of the utopian vision hit the buffers.
Well, maybe I can jump in and share a little bit of the early history in response to those questions, and then Deanna can talk a little bit about where things actually ended up, because the early history is that Google just thought they could digitize everything. And they came into, to be charitable to them, they came into digitizing books with the analogy of scanning web pages into their, into their robot, into their web search robot. And the idea was if you don't opt out of that, the practice on the web is if you don't formally opt out, everything gets sucked into the Google search engine. And they thought, well, great, we'll do this on what'll more or less be an opt-out basis. We'll just digitize everything and make it all searchable. And well, I'm sure I don't have to tell this community that copyright laws don't actually work that way. And so there was early on quite a dispute about how that would work. So Deanna, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the dispute.
Well, it was interesting because Google seemed either naive or non-caring about copyright law, and librarians, of course, cared deeply, and there was quite a discussion about that. And I was at CLEAR at the time, and we put together the Digital Library Federation of about 20 major research libraries. And they had great hopes of digitizing collections on their own. And just to put this in contrast form, they paid $25,000 per institution to put together the money to do it. And of course, that didn't happen because it's a huge job. And only a corporation like Google could even imagine doing the work and actually getting it done. It became quite clear that a group of libraries, no matter how well-intentioned, were not going to achieve this. And first of all, they had to agree on how to do it, what to do, who would be involved, and harder yet to deal with who wasn't involved. So in many ways, we owe a lot to Google because it just went ahead and did it. And I think they scanned the entire collection at the University of Michigan and a large part of it at the University of Stanford, and then parts of other library collections. But, we would, as librarians, we would have spent a long time negotiating with potential partners and what the rules would be. And that just didn't happen. People just did it.
And I think that's exactly right. So Google just did it. They bore a huge risk by doing it because ultimately they ended up, on the copyright side, getting sued by the publishers, by the authors, yes. by I don't even, probably a long list, in fact. And there was an incredibly what to me seems like an incredibly lengthy dispute about whether even the act of scanning the books was a copyright violation or not. Just the reproduction, not even the public display or anything like that. Ultimately this was litigated. There was importantly to our story, there was an effort to settle the case out of court. And the first settlement agreement that was proposed as between Google and the and the publishers, I believe, dozens of parties on the case, maybe hundreds of parties on the case, but between Google and the publishers, the first settlement agreement had the idea in it that Google could, in essence, create a bookstore out of all of these books and create it could be a variety of different ways, but the way I think about it is you could have the ultimate big deal package, right? Where you'd pay $9.99 a month or however it would work, and literally have access to all the books that were ever published. And presumably there could be institutional licenses, individual licenses, and the reason why this had to happen through the settlement agreement, or maybe not had to, but the reason why they wanted it to happen through the settlement agreement was that this was a way of aggregating because it was a class action lawsuit. Because it was a class action lawsuit, the idea was that you could basically get all of the publishers inside of this agreement. And then they would just have to opt out if they didn't want to be in it.
It's important to remember that when Google first thought about this project, it approached the publishers to see if they could scan inventories and recent acquisitions. And they moved fairly quickly to the library community because they had a lot more content. But it helps, I think, to realize that this project started as an idea about working with publishers.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then to see that 10 years later, they were having those difficulties with publishers. I need to be careful because we have somebody who worked in Oxford when Oxford was on the Google Books project in here. But I think Oxford got around this by only digitizing 19th century material. So it was out of copyright material that Oxford held that was digitized. But John will correct me. I hope if I'm wrong on that. Actually, I wanted to bring us in a way round to the long-term implications of the project, and partly thinking about whether or not it was a success in its own terms, but also what effect it has had on our thinking about digitization. And John Pilbeam from Oxford has actually asked a very good question. John, I don't want to put you on the spot. Are you in a position to or comfortable with coming on screen to ask the question yourself, or would you prefer me to read it out? Just put something in chat. I'm not seeing anything at the moment. Okay, so maybe I should just read it. I'm never the best reader out of other people's words, but so John's basically asking the question as to whether you think that the Google project brought us forward in terms of digitization in general than it would have been otherwise. Provided that catalyst, it got us moving forward, or has it held us back a little bit, because it either, John hasn't said this, but it either implied that you needed a big organization with lots of money, or it created some negative perceptions around digitization with some of the key stakeholders, perhaps because of the legal problems and that came, and then so made digitization more. Oh, sorry, John now has said fine to talk, but I'm sorry, John, I've asked you a question, and then made it more difficult. Sorry, you might have lost the sense of the question there in my not very good reading of it. Does that make sense?
It's a terrific question. Well, I'll share my view, maybe, if that's okay, Deanna. I'll just say, I think the answer is actually both of those things. So, in fact, there's probably millions of volumes more digitized today than would have been the case without Google's involvement. I think I don't have any doubt about that, certainly. So the volume of digitization is much, much more. Whether the amount of access to that content is more than it otherwise would have been is a very different question. So today, the access to the content comes about in two different ways. It comes about through a discovery mode, which is to say you can search the full text in Google Books and other places and discover things. And so the volume of discovery has undoubtedly been higher than it otherwise would have been as well. But in terms of the actual access for reading purposes, that's only to out of copyright material, or only through the provisions that HathiTrust and perhaps other digital repositories, but I'm not sure about that, HathiTrust has made to its members based on their collections and for controlled digital lending purposes. Access to the those with reading impairments and so forth as well. And so there might have been less materials digitized, but far wider access to them is one scenario that I could imagine. I don't know, Deanna, I'm not sure if we ever actually asked ourselves the question in quite that formulation, so I'm quite curious what you think.
Well, it's really interesting. I think you're right that access to the material is still a big problem, but discovery is pretty easy. And there are lots of questions for research libraries about at what point, we talk about a universal library, and at what point can we think about combining digital collections into one so that there's one place to go? And I don't know if those discussions are being held by librarians right now or not, but I think it's an interesting question about how you would do it, who would be involved, how can this be made actionable?
Yeah, it's sticking with implications, and I think this issue at Hathi is an interesting one, because it ties in with a question that Paul Ayres is asking about the past 2 years of the pandemic and our changing attitudes. So again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that when Hathi did its emergency library and controlled digital lending, it was basing that on material that had been scanned within the Google Book. So that became a resource, a direct result of that project. And I thought that was fascinating, and that's sort of pushing forward this whole concept of controlled digital lending and how we might move that forward. But Paul specifically asking about whether or not the pandemic has changed our view of digitization of materials, and he's picking out especially materials for students. Having physical libraries shut during the pandemic, having bookshops shut, having people not being able to access the physical copies as they had been previously. Has that sort of changed how we think about about digitization, about the need to have digital copies of materials?
Well, I think one of the results of the Google project is that students expect everything to be in digital form, and they expect to go to their computer and find it. And it's harder, I think, for younger people to think about going to a library and examining the physical volume. They just think everything's digitized and, I should have access to it. And that makes it hard for libraries to figure out what role they should be playing right now, I think.
I think as well, I mean, I think that's the on the user side, I completely agree with that. And I definitely think that a lot of libraries have rethought, what are in essence business continuity considerations, and thinking about how their service profiles can be more resilient in the face of disruptions. And so I don't want to speak for a lot of libraries in particular, but my sense is that both on the instructor side as well as on the provision side through libraries, there's a much greater premium on moving towards digital availability, and also not least for the user considerations that Deanna's spoken about as well.
Yeah, if I'm reading between the lines in Paul's comments, I do know that a lot of us have felt for a long time that some of the e-book and e-textbook business models were not at all satisfactory, if I can create an understatement. But we sort of muddled through with that. But then when we got to lockdown and we were forced into to confront the digital for those materials, it became obvious that those business models just didn't work and didn't scale. And so perhaps thinking about where the intersection with digitalization goes there, and again, perhaps that intersection with controlled digital lending, I think it has generated a lot of interest in CDL and other models for certainly for us in the UK, and I know also in North America and elsewhere. There's another couple of questions about implications and about other formats. I mean, one of the beauties of books was that they were relatively standard. The book object is with lots of variations, but relatively standard. Questions about other types of, were Google ever looking at other types of materials to do that sort of same mass digitization through universities? So either audiovisual materials or questions here about non-published knowledge, so archives, manuscript type collections, museum collections.
Yeah. So Google has, I think they call it an arts and culture initiative, something like that, which has maybe not done the primary digitization of museum collections, but certainly has become a major resource for museum, for search and discovery and delivery of digitized art objects. And if I recall correctly, not just art, but other kinds of museum objects as well. You can look at YouTube. I mean, so let's talk for a moment about audiovisual collections. Libraries have never adequately collected, and I'm talking systematically, there are exceptions, but never really brought audio video in as a sort of first class collecting priority in the same way that they had with books and serials. I'm looking at Deanna, thinking about the Library of Congress, recognizing that that's definitely not true for all libraries, but thinking about the typical library, typical research library, even, I think that's probably a fair assertion. So, if you think about, large portions of cultural heritage certainly in video form, YouTube is possibly, other than, maybe it's the Library of Congress, the British Library, and then YouTube would be my three go-to places for that kind of cultural heritage in video format. And I say that more as an amateur. I have a professional as my co-panelist here on these topics, but I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that I do think Google has a major role to play in some of the other content types. It's more of a question of where it sources them from, which I think is an interesting element.
And if you think about the original Google project, they were just trying to amass content so their site would be searched, and books were standard, and you could go down the shelf and digitize one after another. And it's harder for audiovisual materials, and they require more explanation generally. And so they didn't do that in the first run. It was just not part of what they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And we've touched a little bit on whether the Google project was good for the library community and good for scholarship. Were Google happy? Do you know? Did they think it? They obviously got this content, but they also got embroiled in numerous what they would probably consider very tiresome and tedious lawsuits. Did they think it was a good thing in the end?
Well, go ahead, Deanna. You were about to say something.
It's hard to know what Google thinks about this. We didn't explore that too much, but I don't know what they thought. They scanned every book in the University of Michigan library, so 8 million titles, and that's pretty good. But
maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that it's a little bit. I mean, we've spoken with several people at Google, and the party line is, it's great, it's terrific, we're contributing to the. So let's acknowledge that that's the stated view. But I think if you sort of trace back to why Google cared about books to begin with, the other element of this was, number one, its competition with Amazon, right? And number two, its competition with Apple. Those were actually, and Microsoft. Those were like at a corporate strategy level, those were the three considerations. The libraries were a total afterthought. The content was a total afterthought. Recall, Amazon totally dominates book selling, and the Kindle is the default app and the default device through which ebooks are read, right? So an effort to disrupt that business was one piece of what interested Google about this. They totally failed at disrupting Amazon's dominance of book sales, at least in the US, if you want to think about it that way. Another factor was that Apple was, beginning with iPhones and eventually iPads, and thinking about the sales of all kinds of content through those kinds of platforms, right? So there's a bookstore on Apple, as sometimes people forget. There's, you can buy movies and TV shows and, all of that sort of thing. So did this give Google any measurable advantage in the Android and, Chromebook market? I don't know. I mean, maybe marginally. Ultimately, what this did for Google was it positioned them with an enormous asset for training their computers, training their robots. And I think that, if you look at the ways that, for example, if you look at the ways that Google has come to dominate the consumer online translation business, right? There's reason to believe, and we don't know this for certain, but we've speculated and heard that that having books, the same book in 2 different languages or 7 different languages, as frequently you'll find with professionally translated books in the Google corpus, actually was an enormous asset to them in building out the AI around their translation engine. So there are cases like that where it's impossible for us to understand as an outsider how to put a value on that. Was that worth, X $100 million to them? I don't know. One small bit of evidence is that they have continued the digitization work. We spoke with some individuals at Google just a few months ago who, after the book was published, who shared with us about some of the continuing digitization partnerships. So there clearly is some benefit to them that's continuing to accrue from the project, but exactly what that is not clear to me.
Yeah, and whether it was planned beforehand or it's we've got all this material, what can we do with it type.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Might as well get the rest while we're at it. We don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that comment about Apple shows it suddenly struck me about how a lot of this is prehistory, because before the first iPhone, it's in the history of digital. So as we come towards the top of the hour, and unfortunately we will have to draw this conversation to close. I mean, one of the things that perhaps if we'd had more time, that tension between our desire to collaborate and build consensus and that feeling of, well, just go and do it and find a few willing partners and get it done, is there's an interesting tension there. But are there any sort of final thoughts or final lessons that that having looked into this in detail in the way that you have, that you'd want to give to us, as a library community, as takeaways, if you like?
Well, I would say that we haven't talked about it yet, but the role leadership plays in making something that's just a project into a way of thinking. And there are a few cases where the leadership of the institution or of the library made a huge difference in thinking about what comes next, what would digitization allow, and how do we transform our services to meet those needs. And it's really the role of the leader to have the vision and to imagine what could happen next, rather than just signing up for a project.
So they'd see this project had come along, but they had seen, so if we join this, then these are the other things that we will be able to do.
We can be able to do.
Yeah.
For us, that was a continuing theme, the importance of strong and visionary leadership in the library community in particular, to seize the opportunities that were placed before them. And in some cases, to resist groupthink and, see the benefits of taking strong action, exactly as Deanna said. Yeah.
I think one of the advantages of looking at this as a history now is that we can remind ourselves that these were not uncontroversial matters at the time, and there were divisions within the community as to whether or not this was a good thing to do, whether working with someone like Google was a good thing. So yeah, I think that idea of making sure that we have those discussions and those debates, having those testimonies is in a history like this is hugely valuable. And thinking about how we can move forward and taking on that digital shift. I want to thank you both so much for your time today. I know it's a more early morning for you, start of the day on the west coast of the US. Really pleased that you could join us, sharing your insights with us and the experience of writing this book, and to make us think about some of those opportunities that might be coming towards us now, and what we might want to do next. So thank you so much, and thank you to the audience as well for sharing your questions and your thoughts. My apologies that I wasn't quick enough to bring any of you up onto the virtual stage. but maybe next time. It was great to have somebody who was actually working on the project in Oxford, as giving us some insight into that as well. So please do join us for our next edition of the Digital Shift Forum. Come to the website and register for those meetings. And I hope that you have a fabulous rest of the day, however long that is. And as we come into the Easter holiday, I hope that you get the opportunity to have a break and a very enjoyable holiday if you are able to take some time off. So thank you for joining us.